she saw him coming, so she stepped out of the way, and he raced past her out the door. But the overseer, who was close behind, grabbed a weight from one of the scales on the dry goods store counter and heaved it, intending to hit the young man who was running, but it hit Minty right in her head. She collapsed, fainted, unconscious on the floor. She later said that that weight drove pieces of that scarf right into her skull. They took her back to the plantation where she had been hired. They laid her out on the seat of the loom. There was a loom in this kitchen, and the loom seat is very long. It's like a piano bench. And they laid her on that, and she stayed there for a day and a half, no medical treatment whatsoever. And the plantation owner forced her back out into the fields. And she described how the sweat and the blood was pouring down her face from the wound until she collapsed. It took her months to recover. She was returned to Edward Brodus, and her mother saved her life. But from then on, she suffered from epileptic seizures and vivid dream activity, and she struggled with horrific headaches for the rest of her life. But they didn't have medication for her. She lived with it. And that she felt comforted and secure that God was watching out for her. Once she healed, she was hired out back to Madison, to an enslaver who lived in Madison, and this brought her back to where her father was living and working. She worked for the Stewart family. At first she worked in the house, and then she was sent out into the fields as she got stronger and stronger. Eventually she started working on the wharves. The Stewart family owned agricultural fields. They owned thousands of acres of woodlands, and they had a shipyard and wharves where they traded goods back and forth and filled up ships and unloaded them. And she worked on the docks and got very, very strong and very healthy. Eventually the Stewarts let her go into the woods and cut timber with her father. Her father was a remarkably and a very well-respected lumberjack and timber inspector. So she worked with him. So these were moments that were really important to her. She could not read or write, but she was getting a tremendous education. She was learning how to survive in the woods. The men that she worked with and with her father told her how to survive there. When she worked on the dock, she met black mariners who taught her how that maritime network of communication in black communities worked. It was a secret mail system in a way where black mariners could carry news and information from anywhere in the Chesapeake and the Atlantic world, and they brought it to where Tubman was. These were important skills and important things that she learned that she would use when she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She married a free black man by the name of John Tubman in 1844. He was a free man, born of free parents, and they lived south of Madison in Dorchester County. But in 1849, her enslaver, Edward Brodus, died unexpectedly, leaving his wife, Eliza, in deep debt, and they had 8 children. 6 of them were still young children. She had no money to pay off her creditors, so she decided to start selling some of Tubman's family, including her niece, Keziah, and Keziah's 2 little children, James and baby Araminta. So Tubman knew that she was going to be sold, and a sale into the deep south for an upper south enslaved person was a death sentence. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person coming out of Maryland to Virginia and going to Mississippi or Louisiana or Texas was just 7 years. So they knew it was the end. She was not going to be sold. So on September 17th, 1849, she fled with her brothers, Ben and Henry. But Ben and Henry became frightened about which way to go. Now everybody thinks, oh, everybody knew to follow the North Star and to do all this stuff. That isn't necessarily true, and you needed help because it's scary out there with slave catchers chasing after people who are escaping. This is the runaway advertisement for Harriet Tubman, known as Minty, and her brothers Ben and Harry, who later became Henry. This was discovered in a dumpster in 2001. A house on High Street in Cambridge was sold out of the family for the first time in 200 years, and in their attic they had hundreds and hundreds of old newspapers, and her runaway advertisement was one of those newspapers. Now, for some of you who are familiar with the story, the old myth is there was a $40,000 reward for Harriet Tubman's capture. That is not true. That's totally made up, fake news, never happened at all. In fact, when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln, the first reward for his capture was $25,000. So compare the two. They're not going to have $40,000 to capture Minty Ross. Be that as it may, thank goodness we have this runaway advertisement. But her brothers were frightened, and they knew that if they were caught, they could be killed and certainly sold to the Deep South if they were not killed. So they forced her to come back, but she knew that she was going to be sold, and that was unacceptable. So she fled again by herself in the late fall of 1849 and made her way to freedom. But how did she do it? I'd like to dispel some myths. Yes, she followed the North Star because she grew up in a maritime community and she knew how to navigate by the stars. Many people who were trying to flee in like Kentucky or other places, they didn't know about the North Star. They didn't know how to read the stars at night, but Tubman did. She did not follow the quill code. Fake news never happened. That's not a real thing. That is a myth that was made up in the late 1990s. Lawn jockey. She never followed a lawn jockey. Lawn jockeys weren't even invented until after the Civil War and slavery was over. She also didn't follow the drinking gourd song. That song that we know today was written and recorded in 1947 by a white folk group called Lee Hayes and the Weavers. So none of that. She did use a couple of different spirituals that she would sing to the people she was rescuing. She would have them hide and she'd go out and look for help. And when she'd come back, she would sing a certain song or a song with a certain tempo to indicate to them that it was safe to come out or they'd better stay hidden. There are many ways that people fled, and it's important we know this because we have to tell the truth, because if we don't tell the truth, then the real history is lost and we cannot inspire our young people, we can't inspire ourselves to do something and to make changes in our lives. People fled on boats all the time. They fled on foot, they fled on horses, they fled in wagons, and they fled on trains. Just like, there's no mystery to it. They fled, and it wasn't magic. They just did it, and they were courageous, and it was scary. Tubman had made a connection with a Quaker woman that lived in Caroline County on the eastern shore of Maryland. That woman said to her if she ever needed help to please contact her. So the night that Tubman decided to escape, she went to this woman, and the woman said, "Sweep the yard. When my husband comes home, he'll put you in a wagon and take you to the next stop on the Underground Railroad." When he arrived, he hid her in his wagon and took her to the next stop on a well-organized Underground Railroad network that was comprised of whites and blacks, free and enslaved African Americans. There were enslaved people who were conductors, who were station masters, who were agents on the Underground Railroad. They were the bravest of them all. They made the choice to help other people escape, and they did not leave. And the reason oftentimes that they did not leave is because making that decision to leave meant you would leave everyone you loved behind. Your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, your wife, husband, children. Everyone you loved, you'd have to leave behind. When it came down to making that decision, many people chose not to. They endured enslavement to be with their families. Tubman was transported from one station to the next. She walked, she rode, she was given rides, she was given directions, until eventually she crossed the border into Pennsylvania. And she said this when she remarked to an interviewer later in her life. She was just so poetic, so I am going to give a couple of quotes of hers throughout this. She said, "When I had found that I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." But of course she wasn't in heaven. She made her way to Philadelphia, which was a free city, a large free black population. I think it was 20,000 strong. So she could blend in fairly easily. But she realized when she got there that freedom was hollow without everyone she loved. And she determined right then and there she would go back and rescue her family and friends. Over the next 10 years, 11 years, she would return 13 times and rescue about 70 friends and family. She only went to Maryland. She didn't go to Alabama or Georgia or any other state. She only returned to her home and rescued the people she loved. It was too risky to go to a place that she was not familiar with, and it was too risky to rescue people she did not know because people were betrayed constantly along the Underground Railroad. She had a remarkable network of helpers from Maryland to Delaware, Pennsylvania, New York, New England, into Canada. And you can learn about all of these people. We set up an interactive at the Tubman Park in Dorchester County, and we started building this network. And we had to stop at 50 names because the computer thing couldn't work anymore with so many names on it. But just to imagine, in our social networks, it's very easy to connect with people because we have telephones and Facebook and all of that. She just had her voice and her person. And she connected with some of the greatest abolitionists and Underground Railroad agents in America at the time. They found her to be remarkable. She was an incredible individual, and they could not believe her courage and her great genius. They realized that she had an unbelievable brilliance about her. Even though she could not read or write, she was a genius. Some of the people that helped her: Thomas Garrett, a Quaker in Wilmington; Sam Green, a free black minister in Dorchester County. He was an Underground Railroad agent, and he ended up getting caught in 1857, and he was sent to prison for 10 years. And the all-white jury at first would not convict him as an Underground Railroad agent. So they brought him up to trial again because he had a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Maryland decided that Uncle Tom's Cabin was abolitionist material, and African Americans were not allowed to have abolitionist material. So they sent him to prison for 10 years. William Still was a African American Underground Railroad agent, station master in Philadelphia, one of the greatest in the country at the time. And then there was a committee in Pennsylvania of Lucretia Mott, who was the famous women's rights advocate, and other men and women raised money to help support the Underground Railroad network coming out of the South. William Still kept a journal where he recorded freedom seekers coming through his office. There are about 2,000 that he recorded. Not all of his journals survived, but they still exist today. You can see one of them at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. This is one of the pages from the journal, and it's when Harriet Tubman came through William Still's office in December 29th, 1854, she brought her brothers finally out of slavery during Christmas time that year. And the photograph over in the far right is a picture of her brother Henry, who became William Henry Ross Stewart in freedom. The boys all took freedom names. They changed their names from Ross to Stewart. We're not sure why, but they did. One of the other great Underground Railroad agents lived in New York City, Sidney Howard Gay, and he had a partner, Louis Napoleon, who was an African-American man born in slavery in New York, but manumitted in the early 1800s. And for 40 years, he worked as an Underground Railroad agent in the city, and he would roam the docks in Staten Island and in New York, And he had relationships with black mariners and captains of ships. And so he would get people who were hidden on those ships off, and he'd get them in New York City, put them on trains, house them, get them to move further on north so slave catchers would not catch them. They were a remarkable duo. And this is his journal that you can see. It's online at Columbia University now. It is a remarkable document. And in May of 1856, Harriet Tubman came through his office, and he wrote 5 pages about her. He was so overwhelmed with how amazing she was, and he called her Captain Harriet Tubman. And he describes her story, and she was coming through with a group of 4 men from Dorchester County at the time, and this is one of the runaway advertisements for one of those men that she was accompanying them to the north. And he really was, it's a gift that he wrote this much about Harriet Tubman. The maritime networks were crucial to Tubman and other Underground Railroad agents and people fleeing. The harbor of Baltimore was a hotbed of Underground Railroad activity. So was New Bedford, Massachusetts. And I don't know if you can see the photograph down at the bottom, but there are all those barrels on the wharves. Those barrels are filled with whale oil. And those ships would carry freedom seekers to that area. And in fact, there were quite a few Dorchester County freedom seekers who fled there and ended up in New Bedford. About 40% of free blacks who came from the South living in Massachusetts in 1855 actually came from Maryland. So there was a conduit. That maritime network is really, really important in ferrying people to freedom, but also communication networks, so messages are getting passed back and forth. And I have to give a shout out to market women who worked in these ports and cities throughout the South. They were the ones that passed a lot of messages back and forth. In fact, Frederick Douglass got his seaman's papers from a market woman. And they would have fake certificates of freedom, which free blacks often needed to get out of Maryland. They needed a bond or certificate to say they were free and they could leave the state. These market women had those fake documents, and they would give them out to freedom seekers. They risked a lot to do that job. These are just, you don't have to read the names, I'm not going to read them all, but these are just some of the people in New York alone that Tubman connected with that helped her, men and women. And in a lot of the Underground Railroad histories, you hear a lot about the men, but frankly, who was doing the work? The women. The feeding, the tending of the wounds, and mending clothes and providing clothes, and soothing colicky babies and frightened children. It was the women that were doing all of that. And their social networks, you know how those networks were really powerful. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 that required Northerners to turn in freedom seekers, a lot of freedom seekers fled to Canada where they were safe because slavery had been banned there. So Tubman started bringing her refugees all the way across the suspension bridge at Niagara Falls over to Canada. And it was a pretty active crossing. There was a famous hotel there called the Cataract Hotel. And in the 1850s, in the census records, 80% of the black workers in this hotel gave a birth state as a southern state or unidentified. And they became notorious for their activism when slave catchers would show up in Niagara Falls, because they knew people were escaping across that bridge. The call would go out to the workers at the Cataract Hotel. They would drop everything, even if they were serving people, they would drop everything, run out into the streets, find the slave catcher, harass, beat up, do whatever they had to do, find the freedom seeker, and get them across the bridge. They would create riots and melees to defuse or to distract slave catchers from catching people. They were remarkable, and there's now a brand new visitor center at Niagara Falls that tells the story of these workers at the Cataract Hotel who committed crime after crime in the cause for freedom. Harriet Tubman brought her parents north in 1857. Her father was free. He had purchased Harriet Tubman's mother's freedom for $20 in 1855. They came under suspicion of being Underground Railroad agents, which they were. So she rescued them in 1857 and brought them to Canada and settled them in a small house on North Street in St. Catharines. But in 1859, she purchased a home in Auburn, New York, for her parents to live because they were such an important network of people living in Auburn that she knew would take care of her parents as she continued to work on the Underground Railroad. William Henry Seward, who was Lincoln's Secretary of State, sold her a 7-acre farm for $1,200. But after John Brown's raid, and she and John Brown were very good friends, and she was going to join him on his raid, but fortunately she didn't because she probably would have been killed. She joined the Civil War, the United States Army. She was sent by the governor of Massachusetts to Hilton Head, where she became a spy and a scout, and also a nurse. She is credited with leading an armed raid of the 2nd South Carolina Colored Volunteers up the Combahee River in June of 1863. They routed out rebel forces, they burned down plantations, and they rescued 750 enslaved people during that raid. After the Civil War, she returned to Auburn, New York, where her parents were still living. Her brothers moved there, and other freedom seekers that she had rescued and brought to Canada, they followed her to Auburn, New York. Her husband, John Tubman, remarried after Tubman fled in the early 1850s, and he married a free black woman by the name of Caroline, and they had 4 children together. It broke Tubman's heart, but she moved on. In 1867, he was murdered by a white neighbor. So after that, she felt free to marry again. And in 1869, she married a Civil War veteran, a black soldier who was 22 years younger than she was. And Harriet Tubman took in many people into her home. Her home was always open to anyone in need, the homeless, the sick, the disabled, the starving, the neglected, orphans. She took in orphans all the time. There's an orphanage up in Auburn in Cuyahoga County, New York, and they recently came across their records from the latter half of the 19th century. And Harriet Tubman's name is in there. She was taking in orphans from the orphanage. But Tubman took in everybody in need into her home. She also bought the 25 acres next to her home in Auburn, New York, because she had a dream of opening a home for the aged, particularly for African Americans who were discriminated against in sort of nursing home facilities and hospitals in the region. She successfully purchased the 25 acres. It was sort of like on a wing and a prayer. She got it. And that is part of the national park today as well. And you can visit that home if you go to Auburn, New York. Down here is her church, the Thompson AME Zion Church in Auburn, New York. That is now part of the national park as well. And they are finishing up renovations, and in about a year you'll be able to visit the church and the parsonage as well. She was a deeply, deeply, deeply spiritual person. She practiced many different faiths. She was originally, once she was in freedom, she was a Presbyterian. Then she joined the AME Church, and then the Baptist Church, and then she finally settled on the AME Zion Church. And from my research, it appears that Tubman she preferred to commune with God directly. She didn't need someone to intermediate. But if she liked the minister of a particular church, then that was her church. And then if that minister was transferred somewhere else and she didn't like the new minister, then she went to another church. She was very independently minded that way. She was very active in the women's movement. She attended one of the biggest movements in meetings in 1860 in Boston, New York, where she was introduced, Boston, Massachusetts. She was introduced there in 1860. And she always kept, she kept coming in and out of the movement. She was very, very close to Susan B. Anthony. In fact, she brought freedom seekers to Susan B. Anthony's home in Rochester in the early 1860s. But she had many home responsibilities, so she wasn't as active as I think she wanted to be. I believe that she was really angry with Frederick Douglass, who was a friend of hers, because Frederick Douglass supported the 15th Amendment giving black men the right to vote, but no women. And frankly, Harriet Tubman had done enough to deserve, she thought, the right to vote. So her brothers, who she had to rescue, could vote, and she could not. I could just imagine that just irritated her to no end. So she campaigned for the rest of her life for that right to vote. The women's rights movement became very racist towards moving through the latter part of the 19th century. A lot of white women did not want to support black women's right to vote because they were afraid of their Southern sisters who were completely against letting black women have the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony was not, she was very supportive in many ways that her white counterparts were not, and she and Tubman were very, very close. But Tubman joined the National Association of Colored Women. She traveled to Washington, D.C. in November of 1896 to attend their convention, and I circled her face in that crowd of people during that convention. But she went to many, many meetings in New York, and in fact there was one meeting in Rochester that she attended, and she was introduced as the great liberator and the conductor on the Underground Railroad. And that's where she made the famous comment that she was the only conductor to have never run her train off the track. She's very famous for that. But it was a struggle, as you can imagine. And I'm putting in this statue. This is the design for the statue that's going in Central Park in New York City to celebrate Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and for women's rights to be dedicated next year, 2020, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of getting the right to vote. And it's become a huge controversy. Why just those two women? Why not Sojourner Truth and other African American women who struggled and were part of that movement? Where is their representation here in getting the passage of the vote in 1920? So I think they're going to end up changing the statue. I hope so, because African American women should be part of that monument, in my opinion anyway. Tubman was very successful in opening her home for the aged, and she also had a brick infirmary on her property that was like a nursing home that provided medical services for people as well. These are the board of managers for the Tubman home. This was taken about 9 months before she passed away, and she was wheelchair bound the past couple of years of her life, but she was very, very active. And on her deathbed, Mary Talbot, who was a women's rights activist and a member of the Empire State Federation of Women's Clubs from Buffalo, met with her, and she told Mary Talbot to tell the women to stand together because the division between white women and black women was palpable, and Tubman knew that standing together was the only way to get the vote, because she had watched how slavery finally ended because blacks and whites worked together, and she didn't want to see anyone fail in getting the right to vote.